October 24, 1944, 10:27 a.m., the Sibuyan Sea. A 1,000-pound bomb screams down from a clear Philippine sky and slams into the deck of the largest warship ever built. Steel plates, 13 inches thick, split open like wet paper. Fire erupts, bodies fly. The explosion is so violent that sailors 3 decks below are thrown from their feet. And this is just the first hit. In the next 6 hours, this monster of a battleship, the pride of Imperial Japan, will absorb 17 more bombs and 19 torpedoes. 17 bombs, 19 torpedoes. Numbers that should be impossible for any ship to survive. And yet she fights on. Bleeding oil, burning, listing, refusing to die. Her name is Musashi, 73,000 tons of steel, 263 meters of pure death. 9 guns so massive they could hurl a shell weighing more than a small car over 25 miles. She was supposed to be unsinkable. She was supposed to win the war for Japan. And on this October morning, a 24-year-old American Navy pilot named Bill Burton, a former farm boy from Iowa who had never seen the ocean before, 1942, is about to help send her to the bottom of the sea. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next gripping story. Join us as we uncover more legendary battles, secret operations, and unforgettable heroes from the darkest chapters of human history. Welcome to the channel where history comes alive. By the time the sun sets on this day, 1,376 Japanese sailors will be screaming in oil-slicked water. Over 1,000 more will be dead. And the age of the battleship, 400 years of naval tradition, will be officially over. This is the story of how a generation of farm boys, mechanics, and shop clerks killed a god of steel. To understand why Musashi mattered, you have to understand the nightmare Japan was facing in late 1944. The war had turned, catastrophically. Just 2 years earlier, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ruled the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. Their carriers were the deadliest in the world. Their pilots were legends. Their battleships were the envy of every admiralty on the planet. But by October 1944, that empire was bleeding out. Midway, Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Marianas. One brutal defeat after another. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American pilots had slaughtered Japanese aircraft so completely, the engagement earned a nickname that would haunt Japan forever. The Great Marianas, Turkey Shoot. In a single day, Japan lost over 600 aircraft. 600. Their carrier air arm, once the terror of the Pacific, was effectively wiped out. And now the Americans were coming for the Philippines. If Leyte fell, Japan would be cut off from the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. No oil meant no ships. No ships meant no empire. The math was simple and devastating. Tokyo's response was the plan so desperate, so all or nothing, that even the admirals proposing it called it a suicide mission. Operation Shogo. The idea was insane on its face. Send virtually every remaining Japanese warship, including the 2 largest battleships ever built, on a high-speed dash through enemy waters to attack American troop transports landing at Leyte Gulf. They would have almost no air cover. They would face the most powerful naval air force in human history. They would likely die. The Japanese high command knew the odds. One admiral wept openly when handed the orders. Another reportedly said, "We are throwing away our last fleet." But there was no choice. If they did nothing, Japan would starve. So on October 20th, 1944, the largest Japanese battle fleet in over a year sailed from Brunei Bay, Borneo. 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 15 destroyers. At the heart of this armada steamed 2 Leviathans, the battleship Yamato and her sister Musashi. Together, they represented Japan's last and greatest hope. But waiting for them somewhere east of the Philippines was a force unlike anything the world had ever seen. Admiral William Bull Halsey's Third Fleet. 9 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, hundreds of destroyers and cruisers. And on those flight decks, over 1,000 American aircraft were being fueled, armed, and warmed up, including a Grumman TBF Avenger Tail No. 12 sitting on the deck of the USS Intrepid. Its pilot was about to fly into hell. His name was Lieutenant William E. Burton, Bill to his friends, 24 years old, born and raised in a place called Spencer, Iowa, in the heart of corn country. His father owned a small hardware store. His mother taught Sunday school. Before the war, Bill Burton had two dreams: marry his high school sweetheart Margaret and take over his uncle's farm outside town. He had never even seen the ocean until he enlisted in the Navy in early 1942. Bill was by every measure an ordinary American kid, 6 feet tall, sandy brown hair, quiet, polite, the kind of young man neighbors described as level-headed and reliable. He liked baseball. He liked tinkering with engines, a skill he'd picked up working summers at his uncle's farm. That mechanical instinct turned out to matter. When the Navy gave him an aptitude test in boot camp, he scored off the charts in spatial reasoning and machine systems. 6 months later, Bill Burton was sitting in the cockpit of a Grumman TBF Avenger, the largest single-engine carrier aircraft ever built. A torpedo bomber, a whale of a plane that weighed nearly 8 tons fully loaded. The kind of aircraft that demanded brutal precision and icy nerves. By October 1944, Burton had flown 47 combat missions. He had attacked Japanese airfields in the Marshalls. He had bombed merchant shipping near Truk. He had survived a near miss off Saipan when anti-aircraft fire shredded his right wing, and he barely made it back to the carrier. But nothing had prepared him for what he saw at 10:23 a.m. on October 24, 1944. Burton's squadron, Torpedo 18 off the Intrepid, had been launched as part of a strike group sent to investigate radar contacts in the Sibuyan Sea. As his Avenger climbed through 8,000 feet, his radio crackled with the voice of his squadron leader. Then the clouds parted. And Bill Burton, farm boy from Iowa, looked down. What he saw made his throat close up. It was a fleet, but not just any fleet, the biggest concentration of warships he had ever witnessed in his life. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, cutting white wakes across the dark blue water in tight defensive formation. And right in the center, dwarfing every other vessel like an adult standing among children, were two ships so massive they didn't even look real: Yamato and Musashi. Burton later wrote in his diary, "It was like seeing a mountain range floating on the sea. I had never imagined a ship could be that big. My hands were shaking on the stick." He was about to help kill one of them. The crazy idea wasn't really one idea. It was the entire radical doctrine that the United States Navy had bet everything on in the late 1930s, a doctrine that admirals around the world had called naive, foolish, and even suicidal. The idea was simple. Carrier aircraft, not battleships, would rule the seas. You have to understand how insane this sounded in 1939. For 400 years, naval supremacy had meant one thing: big ships with big guns. The British Empire was built on broadsides. The Spanish Armada, Trafalgar, Jutland. Every major naval engagement in history had been decided by armored ships hammering each other with shells. Aircraft were toys, bug-like contraptions of canvas and wood. The notion that flimsy little planes could sink a heavily armored battleship was treated as fantasy. When American General Billy Mitchell tried to prove it in 1921 by bombing the captured German battleship Ostfriesland, naval brass was so outraged they court-martialed him. Mitchell was a maniac, they said, a heretic, a self-promoter. Battleships were unsinkable, but quietly, a small group of American naval officers, men with names like Reeves Towers and Halsey, had been studying Mitchell's tests. And they had drawn a different conclusion. They believed Mitchell was right. They believed the future of naval warfare wasn't 16-inch guns. It was 1,000-pound bombs delivered from the air. And they convinced the U.S. Navy to gamble. Throughout the 1930s, while Japan poured its industrial might into building Yamato and Musashi, the floating fortresses to end all fortresses, America built Carriers: Lexington, Saratoga, Yorktown, Enterprise, Hornet. They trained pilots. They developed dive bombing techniques that could plant a bomb on a target the size of a tennis court. They invented the torpedo plane. Pearl Harbor proved them right in the most agonizing way imaginable. Japanese carrier aircraft in a single morning sank or crippled most of the American battle line. But Japan, even after their own success, didn't fully accept the lesson. They kept building Musashi, kept believing that one day somewhere the great gun versus gun battle would still come, that their unsinkable monster would be the deciding factor. They were about to learn in the most catastrophic way possible that they were wrong. By August 1944, the U.S. Navy had perfected its carrier doctrine to a level of lethal precision. American pilots could put a torpedo into a moving ship from 1,000 yards out. Dive bomber crews could split a 500-pound bomb between two stacks. They trained relentlessly day and night on simulated battleship targets. Bill Burton was one of those pilots, and he had been told repeatedly in countless briefings what would happen if he ever encountered a Japanese super-battleship. You hit it, then you hit it again, then you keep hitting it until it goes down. The first test of the new doctrine against a Yamato-class behemoth came not from carrier aircraft, but from an American submarine. It was March 29, 1944. The waters off Palau. The submarine USS Tunney, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John Scott, had been hunting in the area for days when her sonar picked up the unmistakable acoustic signature of a massive ship. Scott raised his periscope. What he saw nearly made him laugh out loud. Musashi, steaming alone with a small destroyer escort, apparently completely unaware of the predator stalking her from below. Scott had one chance. He fired a 6-torpedo spread from over 4,000 yards out in extreme range, almost a desperation shot. He flooded the tubes, dropped the periscope, and held his breath. For nearly 4 full minutes, nothing happened. Then, far away across the dark water, his crew heard a single deep, booming explosion. One hit. Out of 6 torpedoes. Just one. But that one, Mark 14 torpedo, packing 643 pounds of Torpex explosive, had struck Musashi near the bow. It tore a hole in her armored hull and caused over 3,000 tons of seawater to flood her forward compartments. The mighty battleship had to limp back to Japan for emergency repairs in dry dock at Kure. When Japanese engineers inspected the damage, they were shocked. The hole was massive. A single torpedo fired from miles away by an enemy they never saw had wounded the supposedly invincible Musashi. They patched her up. They bolted on more anti-aircraft guns, over 100 of them now. They told themselves it was a fluke, a lucky shot. The reaction in American Navy Command was very different. Submarine reports flowed up the chain. Engineers studied the damage estimates. Pilots in flight schools heard rumors. The lesson was clear and electric. The super-battleships could be hurt. They could bleed. They were not gods. They were just ships. Very, very big ships, but still just ships. And ships could be sunk if you hit them often enough, hard enough in the right places. Submarine attacks alone wouldn't be enough. Subs took weeks to set up a single shot. To kill a Yamato-class battleship in a single engagement, you would need overwhelming simultaneous multi-axis attack. You would need dozens of aircraft, from multiple carriers, coordinated to perfection, diving and torpedoing from every angle at once, splitting the defender's attention, turning their massive anti-aircraft batteries into useless, flailing chaos. It had never been attempted before. Not on a target this size, not with this many planes, not at this scale. When Bill Burton's squadron commander briefed his men on the morning of October 24th, he laid out the plan with brutal clarity. Gentlemen, today we may engage Japanese capital ships, including the Yamato class. If we do, you will press your attacks until you score hits. You will not break off. You will not return to the carrier with unfired ordnance unless you are physically unable to fly. The Pacific War could be decided in the next 6 hours. Are there questions? There were none. At 8:22 a.m., The first wave of American aircraft thundered off the catapults of intrepid Cabot, Essex, Lexington, Franklin, and Enterprise. By 10:25 a.m. they had located the enemy. By 10:27 a.m. the first bombs were falling. What followed was unlike anything in the history of naval warfare. American pilots, many of them in their early 20s, farm boys and shop clerks and college students, just like Bill Burton, threw themselves into the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire the world had ever seen. Musashi's gunners fired wildly into the sky. Black puffs of flak filled the air so densely that pilots described it as flying through a thunderstorm of metal. Tracers streaked past their canopies. Wingmen disappeared in fireballs. The noise was deafening. Burton's Avenger, carrying a single Mark 13 aerial torpedo weighing over 2,000 pounds, was in the second wave. As he pushed the nose down and dove from 8,000 feet toward the dark racing shape of Musashi, below his world shrank to a single tunnel of focus. Altitude, airspeed, release point. He could feel the airframe shuddering as flak burst around him. He could see tiny figures running on Musashi's deck. He could see the muzzle flashes of her secondary batteries, each one trying to kill him personally. At 800 feet, he leveled off. At 400 feet just above the waves now, he closed to 1,000 yards from the target. He thumbed the release. The Avenger lurched upward as the torpedo dropped free. Burton banked hard left, applied full throttle, and ran for his life across the wave tops. Behind him, his torpedo splashed into the sea, ran true, and began racing toward the port side of the largest warship Japan had ever built. 18 seconds. That was how long it would take to find out if everything America had bet on, all the carriers, all the training, all the doctrine, was about to be vindicated in blood and steel and fire. Behind Burton, dozens more American aircraft were doing exactly the same thing. From every direction at once, diving, releasing, torpedoing, strafing. A storm of explosives converging on a single target. The first wave alone scored hits. Hits that staggered the giant. Hits that opened gashes in her armored skin. Hits that started fires deep inside her bowels. By 11 a.m. Musashi was already listing, already slowing, already bleeding. But she was not yet dying. Captain Toshihira Inoguchi paced Musashi's smoke-filled bridge, his face grim, his uniform soaked in salt spray and blood from a wounded officer beside him. He had been told his entire career that this ship was unsinkable. Now he was watching her shudder and groan beneath his feet as wave after wave of American aircraft hammered her without pause. He looked at his radar officer. "How many more are coming?" The young officer's face was white. "Sir, there are still hundreds of them out there. They keep launching. It's not stopping." Captain Inoguchi closed his eyes for one long moment. He understood in that instant what Japan had refused to understand for a decade. The age of the battleship was over. He was standing on a tomb, but he would not give the order to retreat. He would not abandon his ship. He had sworn an oath, and Toshihira Inoguchi was a man who kept his word. Far above Bill Burton was already turning his Avenger back toward the Intrepid, reloading, refueling, preparing for the second strike, and the third, and the fourth. In the next 6 hours, the men of the United States Pacific Fleet would write a new chapter in the history of war. They would prove in front of God and history that the era of the floating fortress was dead. But first, they would have to kill her, and Musashi, with 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes, still to come with fires raging through her decks, and a captain refusing to leave her bridge, was about to give them the fight of their lives. In Part 2, you will witness the most brutal sustained aerial assault on a single warship in the entire history of naval combat. You will see the moment Captain Inoguchi makes a decision that will shock his own crew. You will meet the American pilots who flew through walls of fire to land the killing blows. And you will discover the heart-stopping final hour of the IJN Musashi, the greatest battleship that ever sailed, as she rolls onto her side and slips into the black water of the Sibuyan Sea forever. But could even the death of Musashi save the Philippines? Could it stop Japan's last desperate gambit? Or was Leyte Gulf about to become an even greater catastrophe than anyone aboard those carriers could imagine? The answer is coming. and it will leave you speechless. When we left off, Bill Burton, a 24-year-old farm boy from Iowa, had just released a 2,000-pound torpedo at the largest battleship ever built. Behind him, hundreds of American carrier aircraft were proving a doctrine the world had called insane for 2 decades. Carrier aviation could kill a battleship. The first hits had landed. Musashi was bleeding. But killing a Yamato-class super-battleship was not a matter of one lucky hit, or 10, or even 15. To put this monster on the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea would require something never attempted in human history: a sustained, coordinated multi-wave aerial slaughter unlike anything ever inflicted on a single warship. And here is the shocking statistic that historians still struggle to comprehend. Over the next 6 hours, the United States Navy would launch 6 separate strike waves against Musashi, 259 aircraft in total. They would dive through the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire in naval history. They would lose 18 planes. And they would unleash punishment so extreme that Japanese engineers after the war would refuse to believe the numbers when American intelligence presented them. And this is where things get even worse for the men aboard Musashi. Inside Musashi's smoke-choked bridge, Captain Toshihira Inoguchi was facing an enemy he could not shoot back at. Institutional arrogance. His own. For 20 years, the entire Imperial Japanese Navy had been built around one unshakable belief. The battleship was supreme. Aircraft were a nuisance. Yamato-class ships were unsinkable. This wasn't just doctrine. It was religion, and the high priest of that religion was sailing a few miles ahead aboard the heavy cruiser Yamato. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. Kurita was a brilliant officer, a veteran of countless engagements, but he was also a product of the old school. When Japanese naval aviators had warned him repeatedly that sailing into the Sibuyan Sea without air cover was suicidal, Kurita had dismissed them. "Our battleships have the heaviest armor in the world," he reportedly told his staff. "Their anti-aircraft batteries can repel any air attack. We will break through." He was wrong, catastrophically wrong. But Kurita was just one man in a long chain of stubborn refusals. Years earlier, when junior Japanese officers had argued that more carriers should be built instead of Musashi, they had been silenced, demoted, transferred. One commander, Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had begged the high command to convert Musashi into a carrier while she was still under construction. He was ignored. The battleship faction was too powerful, too political, too proud. Now, on October 24, 1944, the bill for that arrogance was coming due in blood. Aboard the bridge, Captain Inoguchi watched as the second wave of American aircraft appeared on the horizon. He turned to his executive officer. "Signal Yamato. Request permission to fall back to formation rear. We are absorbing too much damage." The reply came back within minutes. Stark, brutal, from Admiral Kurita himself. "Maintain position. Continue advance. The fleet must reach Leyte." Inoguchi stared at the message. He understood. Kurita could not lose face by admitting his battleships needed protection. To pull Musashi back would be to confess that the entire Japanese naval doctrine had been wrong. That the men who built her, the admirals who commanded her, the politicians who funded her, had all been chasing a ghost. But there was an unexpected ally watching from the skies above. Lieutenant Commander Hideo Kondo was a Japanese naval aviator, one of the few experienced pilots Japan had left after the Marianas Turkey shoot. Kondo had been assigned to a land-based fighter unit at Mabalacat Airfield in the Philippines. And from his cockpit monitoring radio traffic, he could hear the desperate transmissions from Musashi's gunnery officers. He could see the smoke rising from the Sibuyan Sea, even from 200 miles away. Kondo grabbed his squadron commander. "Sir, Musashi is being slaughtered. We have to launch fighters now. Even 10 Zeros could break up the attack waves long enough for the fleet to scatter." His commander hesitated. Standing orders were to preserve aircraft for a planned operation, the first organized kamikaze sortie scheduled for the next morning. Launching now would compromise that mission, but Kondo persisted. "Sir, If Musashi sinks, the entire fleet is finished. We launch now, or we lose everything. After 20 agonizing minutes of phone calls to higher command, the answer came back. No. The fighters would be held in reserve. Musashi would have to fight alone. Kondo slammed his fist against the briefing table. He knew what that decision meant. He had just heard the death sentence of 1,000 of his countrymen. While Japanese command paralyzed itself with politics, the Americans were running their own unprecedented experiment in real time. And the conditions could not have been more brutal. The setting was the Sibuyan Sea on a partly cloudy October afternoon. The witnesses were every senior officer in Halsey's Third Fleet watching radar screens and listening to combat radio. The terms were simple. Sink the largest, most heavily armored warship ever built using nothing but carrier aircraft. No battleships, no cruisers, just planes and pilots and 1,000-pound bombs. The first wave had been a probe. Fewer than 30 aircraft. They scored 2 bomb hits and 1 torpedo strike. Encouraging, but not decisive. The second wave doubled down. 42 aircraft from Intrepid and Cabot. They came in coordinated dive bombers from above and torpedo planes from the sides at wave-top altitude. Bill Burton's Avenger was among them. By the time the second wave departed, Musashi had absorbed 3 more torpedoes and at least 4 bomb hits. Her speed dropped from 27 knots to 22. Then came the third wave at 1330, 29 aircraft. Then the fourth wave at 1430, 65 aircraft. Then the fifth wave at 1500, 75 aircraft. Each wave larger than the last. Each more concentrated. Each timed precisely to hit Musashi, while her damage control crews were still struggling with the previous wave's wounds. Aboard the Intrepid Admiral Gerald Bogan watched the radar plot in stunned silence. He turned to his chief of staff. "Are we hitting her? Is she going down?" The reply was almost a whisper. "Sir, our pilots report hundreds of hits, and she's still afloat. She's still moving. I've never seen anything like it." This was the test, in real time, with the world watching. Could carrier aviation truly kill a Yamato-class battleship? Or was Musashi's armor going to vindicate the battleship admirals after all American officers exchanged nervous glances? Some pilots began to doubt. Was this thing actually immortal? Then, at 1515, the breakthrough came. The fifth wave concentrated all its torpedoes on Musashi's port side, a coordinated assault that put 7 torpedoes into nearly the same 100-foot stretch of hull. The damage was catastrophic. 3 boiler rooms flooded simultaneously. 2 main engines failed. Musashi's speed dropped to 6 knots. She was dying. The reaction across the American fleet was electric, from skepticism to amazement to triumph in the span of minutes. Halsey himself, monitoring from his flagship New Jersey, sent a message to the carrier task group commanders. "Magnificent work. Continue strikes until target destroyed." The numbers told the story. Before the attacks began, Musashi had displaced 73,000 tons. By 1700, she had taken on so much water that her displacement had increased by an estimated 25,000 tons of flooding. Her draft had increased by 6 feet. She was sinking before their eyes. The before and after was undeniable. A ship designed to be unsinkable was being killed in plain daylight by an enemy she could not even reach with her main guns. 25 years of carrier doctrine. Vindicated in 6 hours. But success in the Sibuyan Sea was one thing. The wider war was another matter entirely. Even as Musashi began her final death roll, Admiral Kurita made a decision that would echo through history. With Musashi crippled and his fleet badly mauled, he ordered a temporary withdrawal to the west away from Leyte Gulf. He needed to regroup. Then, hours later, he reversed course, turned back east, pushed through San Bernardino Strait under cover of darkness. By dawn on October 25th, Kurita's remaining battleships, including Yamato herself, would emerge into the Philippine Sea and stumble upon a force of American escort carriers off Samar. tiny, lightly armored, unsuspecting. This was the nightmare scenario. Halsey's main fleet, having been lured north by Japanese decoy carriers, was hundreds of miles away. The escort carriers were defenseless against Yamato's 18-inch guns. But the lesson of Musashi had spread through the entire American fleet faster than any official memo could carry it. The pilots of those tiny escort carriers, men who had spent the war hunting submarines and supporting Marines, suddenly found themselves facing the largest concentration of Japanese battleships still afloat. They had seen what carrier aircraft did to Musashi the day before. They had heard the radio reports. They knew it could be done. And so, on the morning of October 25th off the coast of Samar, history's most lopsided naval engagement began. American destroyer escorts charged Japanese battleships. American Avengers and Wildcats, many carrying only general-purpose bombs and depth charges meant for submarines, attacked Yamato directly. The Japanese, bewildered by the ferocity of the resistance, began to suffer mounting losses. 3 Japanese heavy cruisers sunk, 3 more crippled. Yamato herself forced to evade torpedoes. Kurita, shaken and confused, eventually broke off the attack and retreated. The carrier doctrine had not just won at the Sibuyan Sea. It had proven itself in the most desperate improvised last-ditch combat imaginable. Even half-trained pilots in obsolete aircraft, when armed with the right doctrine and the right weapons, could turn back the most powerful battleship fleet in Japanese history. From insane idea to ridiculed theory, to official doctrine, to war-winning weapon. All in the span of 3 years. All confirmed in the burning, sinking, screaming hell of the Sibuyan Sea on October 24, 1944. Bill Burton flew his 4th and final mission of the day at 15:45. By the time he landed back on Intrepid, he had lost 2 friends from his squadron. He sat in the ready room, hands shaking too violently to hold a coffee cup. He had just helped sink the biggest warship ever built. He didn't speak for an hour. In Tokyo, news of Musashi's loss was suppressed. The Japanese public would not learn of her sinking until after the war ended. The High Command understood immediately and with crushing clarity what her death meant. The Imperial Japanese Navy, the force that had ruled the Pacific for 40 years, was effectively finished. But the war was not over, and Japan, facing total defeat, was about to unleash a weapon so horrifying, so desperate, so utterly unthinkable, that even the hardened pilots of the U.S. Pacific Fleet would be left wondering if humanity itself was breaking apart in the skies over the Philippines. Lieutenant Commander Kondo, the Japanese pilot whose request to launch fighters had been denied, was already being briefed on his next mission. He would not be intercepting American aircraft. He would not be defending Japanese ships. He would be doing something else entirely. Something that had no name yet in any naval manual on Earth. In Part 3, you will witness the birth of the kamikaze. You will meet the young pilots, average age 21, who volunteered to crash their planes directly into American carriers. You will see the moment Bill Burton, returning from Musashi's destruction, looks up to see a Japanese Zero diving not to drop a bomb, but to become one. And you will discover how the United States Navy, fresh from its greatest victory, was about to face the most psychologically terrifying enemy of the entire Pacific War. Because Musashi's death had not ended Japan's resistance. It had transformed it into something far darker and far more personal. The real war was just beginning. When we left off, the Imperial Japanese Navy's super-battleship Musashi had been torn apart by 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes in a single afternoon. Carrier aviation had triumphed. The doctrine that admirals once called insane had killed the largest warship ever built. From ridiculed theory to war-winning weapon in 3 years. But Japan was not finished. Not yet. Tokyo's reaction to Musashi's death was not surrender. It was something far darker. Something that would horrify even the American pilots who had just won the greatest air versus sea battle in history. Here is the chilling statistic that defined the next 10 months of the Pacific War. After October 25, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy formally adopted a new combat doctrine. They called it Tokutai. Special attack units. The world would come to call it kamikaze. Within 6 months, over 3,800 Japanese pilots would deliberately crash their aircraft into American warships. They would damage 368 vessels. They would sink 47. And they would kill nearly 5,000 American sailors. This was no longer a test of doctrine. This was a war for survival. The first reports reached American naval intelligence within 48 hours of Musashi's sinking. Coded transmissions intercepted at Pearl Harbor. Reconnaissance photos of unusual aircraft fittings. And then on October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar, the first confirmed kamikaze strike. Lieutenant Yukio Seki dove his Zero fighter directly into the flight deck of the escort carrier USS St. Lo. The ship exploded and sank within 30 minutes. 113 American sailors died. When word reached Admiral Halsey aboard New Jersey, witnesses said the old warrior went pale. He immediately convened an emergency conference with his task group commanders. "Gentlemen, the Japanese have introduced a new tactic," Halsey reportedly said. "They are using their aircraft as guided weapons. We have no defensive doctrine for this. Develop one." The numbers that followed were terrifying. In the next 30 days, kamikaze attacks damaged 22 American warships. Then 41 in the following month. Then 87. The escort carrier USS Omni Bay sunk. The cruiser USS Nashville, 133 dead. The destroyer USS Mahan vaporized. In Tokyo, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the architect of the kamikaze program, addressed his pilots with brutal clarity. "Japan is in grave danger. The salvation of our country is now beyond the power of the ministers, the general staff, or even myself. It can only be saved by you young men." The Japanese were betting that American morale would collapse, that the sight of their ships exploding from suicide attacks would force the United States to negotiate peace. They were trying to make the cost of victory unbearable. But they had miscalculated. Badly. Because Bill Burton and his fellow pilots, the men who had killed Musashi, were not breaking. They were adapting. But adapting came at a brutal cost, and the cost was technical, organizational, and human. By December 1944, the U.S. Pacific Fleet faced a crisis that no one in Washington had predicted. The very carrier doctrine that had won at the Sibuyan Sea was suddenly inadequate. Existing fighter screens designed to intercept conventional bombers could not stop a determined pilot willing to die. The math was savage. A traditional Japanese bomber needed to drop its payload maneuver and survive. A kamikaze pilot needed only to crash. He could ignore evasive maneuvers. He could absorb cannon fire. He could fly through walls of flak that would turn back any sane attacker. Aboard the carrier, USS Intrepid, Bill Burton watched as his ship took its first kamikaze hit on November 25, 1944. A Zero slammed into the flight deck near the forward elevator. 65 sailors died in seconds. Burton saw a friend, a 22-year-old plane captain from Ohio, simply erased. There was nothing left to bury. The pressure on American command was immense. Newspapers back home began running casualty lists. Admiral Nimitz received urgent cables from Washington demanding solutions. Some senior officers' men who had opposed the carrier doctrine all along began whispering that the entire Pacific strategy needed to be reconsidered. One vice admiral wrote bitterly to a colleague, "We won at Leyte, but now we are losing ships every day to suicide attacks. Was this victory worth the cost?" The blame unfairly began to land on the carrier admirals, on the pilots, on the doctrine itself. Critics argued that battleships with their heavier anti-aircraft batteries would have been better protection, that carriers were too vulnerable, that the experiment had failed. For Bill Burton, sitting in the ready room reading casualty reports, the doubt was crushing. He had helped sink the largest battleship in history, but now he was watching his own ship burn under attacks that could not be stopped. Was carrier doctrine actually a mistake? Then came Okinawa, and everything changed. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. The largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. 1,300 American warships. 180,000 troops. The target was Okinawa, the last major island before the Japanese home islands themselves. Whoever controlled Okinawa controlled the invasion route to Tokyo. The Japanese threw everything they had left into stopping it, including Operation Ten-Go. The final death ride of Yamato Musashi's sister ship, sailing on a one-way mission with only enough fuel to reach Okinawa, never to return. On April 7, 1945, American carrier pilots received an alert. Yamato was at sea, heading south at 22 knots, escorted by 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers. No air cover. For Bill Burton, now a senior pilot aboard Intrepid's torpedo squadron, the news was electric. Yamato, the sister of Musashi, the last Japanese super-battleship still afloat. The strike force assembled at dawn. 386 aircraft from 11 American carriers. Bill Burton was assigned as flight leader of a 12-plane Avenger element. Their orders were brutally simple. Sink Yamato. The weather was terrible. Heavy clouds, driving rain, visibility under 1,000 feet. Burton's squadron found Yamato at 12:32 hours 200 miles southwest of Kyushu in the East China Sea. What followed was a textbook execution of everything carrier doctrine had been designed to do. The first wave struck at 12:37, dive bombers from Bennington and Hornet. 2 bomb hits within 90 seconds. Yamato shuddered. The second wave hit at 12:47. Avengers from Intrepid and Yorktown. Burton led his element down through the cloud layer at 800 feet. The flak was blinding. Tracers everywhere. He could see Yamato's massive 18-inch guns firing into the air special anti-aircraft shells called Sanshikidan, exploding in deadly clouds. Burton lined up his torpedo run from 1,200 yards. He pickled the release. The Avenger lurched. He banked away. His torpedo struck Yamato amidships port side. The third wave came at 1,300. The fourth at 1,315. The fifth at 1,330. Heats accumulating. Damage cascading. Yamato listing 5 degrees, then 10, then 15. By 14:02, Yamato had taken at least 11 torpedo hits and 7 bomb hits. Her port side was a mass of flooding. Her speed had dropped to 7 knots. Then to dead in the water, at At 14:23, the unthinkable happened. Yamato's massive forward magazines holding hundreds of tons of explosives for her 18-inch guns cooked off in a chain reaction. The explosion was so massive that the mushroom cloud rose 19,000 feet into the sky. American pilots saw it from 100 miles away. Japanese observers on Kyushu felt the shockwave. Yamato was gone. 3,055 of her 332 crewmen died with her, including Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, who locked himself in his cabin rather than abandon ship. American losses for the entire engagement: 10 aircraft, 12 men. Bill Burton landed back on Intrepid at 16:20. His Avenger had 3 flak holes through the wing and a bullet hole inches from his fuel line. He climbed out of the cockpit, walked to the ready room, and sat down without a word for 10 full minutes. He had now helped sink both Yamato-class super-battleships, the 2 largest warships ever built. The pride of Imperial Japan, sunk by farm boys and mechanics flying off wooden decks. Later, Burton wrote a single line in his diary that night. "We did it, twice. May God forgive us all." The news of Yamato's destruction reached Tokyo within hours. Emperor Hirohito reportedly went silent for an entire afternoon when informed. The Imperial Japanese Navy was now officially and irrevocably finished. In the weeks that followed, the strategic implications cascaded across the Pacific. Japanese surface fleet operations ceased entirely. Their remaining warships hid in port, unwilling to face American carrier aircraft. The defense of the home islands now rested almost entirely on land-based aviation and kamikazes. American pilots noted the change immediately. Japanese sortie rates dropped 60% in the month after Yamato's death. Resistance at sea collapsed. The U.S. Navy could now operate within sight of the Japanese coastline with near impunity. By June 1945, American carrier task forces were launching strikes directly against Tokyo. Yokohama, Nagoya. Aircraft from the same carriers that had killed Musashi were now bombing the Japanese capital itself. The casualty math was staggering. Carrier aviation in its final 10 months of war had sunk 4 Japanese battleships, 11 carriers, and over 200 other warships. American losses to surface gunfire during the same period, effectively 0. The doctrine had not just won, it had revolutionized warfare itself. Newspapers back home began running stories about the carrier pilots. Life magazine featured Bill Burton's squadron in a full-page spread. The pilots who had once been treated as glorified mailmen were now national heroes. Admiral Halsey, in a victory speech, said it plainly. The aircraft carrier is now and forever the queen of battles at sea. The age of the battleship is dead, and we have buried it. The Soviets took notes. The British took notes. The French took notes. Every navy on Earth began converting its strategy. Battleship construction halted globally. Carrier programs accelerated. The world's navies were being rebuilt in the image of what Bill Burton and 5,000 other American pilots had proven over Musashi and Yamato. Bill Burton received the Navy Cross for his actions on October 24, 1944. He received a Gold Star in lieu of a second Navy Cross for the Yamato strike on April 7, 1945. By the war's end, he had flown 89 combat missions and been credited with participating in the destruction of both Japanese super-battleships. He was 25 years old. When Japan surrendered aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, Bill Burton was watching from the deck of Intrepid, anchored in Tokyo Bay. He stood with his squadron mates as the surrender documents were signed. He thought about the men who had not made it, about his friend from Ohio, about the Japanese sailors floating in oil-slicked water in the Sibuyan Sea. The war was over. The age of the battleship was over. A revolution in naval warfare was complete. But what happened to the man who flew through 18 separate strike waves and lived to tell about it? What became of Bill Burton, the farm boy from Iowa, who helped kill 2 of the greatest warships ever built? His story did not end at Tokyo Bay. It did not end with the medals, or the headlines, or the parades. The most extraordinary chapter of his life was still ahead of him. And it would involve a return trip to Japan that no one expected. A meeting that should have been impossible. And a final secret about the sinking of Musashi that has never been widely told. This story has one more chapter. A chapter that few historians have ever written. And it begins with a phone call Bill Burton received in 1972, 27 years after the war ended. A phone call from a man whose father had died on Musashi. And what happened next will leave you speechless. When we left off, Bill Burton, the farm boy from Iowa, had helped sink both Japanese super-battleships Musashi and Yamato. He had flown 89 combat missions. He had received the Navy Cross twice. The age of the battleship was officially dead buried by carrier aircraft and the men who flew them. And on September 2, 1945, Bill Burton stood on the deck of USS Intrepid in Tokyo Bay, watching Japan's formal surrender. But what happened to him after that historic morning? What became of the 25-year-old pilot who had helped revolutionize naval warfare itself? Here is the twist that no one expected. The hero who killed 2 of the largest warships ever built spent the next 27 years trying to forget what he had done. And in 1972, a single phone call from a stranger would force him to confront a truth about Musashi that would shake him to his core. Because sometimes, victory comes with a price that takes decades to fully understand. Bill Burton came home to Iowa in November 1945. He married his high school sweetheart Margaret in a small ceremony at his hometown church in Spencer. He took over his uncle's farm just as he had always planned. And for nearly 2 decades, he refused to discuss the war with anyone, including his own children. Neighbors knew vaguely that Bill had been a Navy pilot. That was all. The Navy crosses sat in a wooden box at the back of his closet. The medals were never displayed. When Margaret asked him once in 1951 why he never talked about his service, Burton reportedly answered, because every time I close my eyes I see them. The Japanese sailors, in the water, burning. He suffered what we now call PTSD. In 1945 they called it combat fatigue, or simply war nerves. There were no support groups, no therapy. Burton coped the way millions of veterans did, through silence, hard labor, and prayer. Meanwhile, his squadron mates scattered across America. His wingman from the Yamato Strike Lieutenant Tom Rivera became a commercial airline pilot. His radio operator, Petty Officer James Walsh, opened a hardware store in Maine. His best friend from boot camp, the one killed at Intrepid in November 1944, was buried in Arlington with a flag-draped headstone Burton visited every 5 years. The men who had opposed carrier doctrine fared differently. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, the Japanese commander who refused to protect Musashi, survived the war. He returned to Japan in disgrace, spent his remaining years teaching at a naval academy, and died in obscurity in 1977. He gave only one interview about Leyte Gulf. When asked why he turned back from the American escort carriers off Samar, he reportedly answered, "Because I had already lost everything, including Musashi." Captain Toshihira Inoguchi, who went down with Musashi, was posthumously promoted to vice admiral. His final letter recovered after the war contained a single line. "Tell Japan that battleships could not save us. Only her people can." Bill Burton kept that quote pinned to his barn wall for the rest of his life. He never explained why. But Burton's true legacy was never going to be measured in medals or memoirs. The carrier doctrine that killed Musashi reshaped the world for the next 80 years, and Bill Burton in his quiet Iowa farmhouse had helped write the rules every Navy on Earth would follow. By 1950, just 5 years after the war, every major power was building or operating aircraft carriers. The Soviet Union, despite its land power tradition, launched its first dedicated carrier programs after studying Leyte Gulf. The British Royal Navy, which had still maintained battleship priorities in 1944, scrapped its remaining battleships entirely by 1960. The French, the Italians, the Indians, the Brazilians, all converted to carrier-centric naval strategies. In Korea, just 5 years after Burton sank, Yamato American carriers launched 250,000 combat sorties from offshore. Marine pilots flying Corsairs and Sky Raiders, descendants of the same doctrine Burton had pioneered, provided close air support that saved untold thousands of UN troops at the Pusan perimeter. The math was undeniable. Carriers had become the dominant projection of American military power on Earth. In Vietnam, U.S. Navy carrier aircraft flew over 1.7 million sorties from 1964 to 1973. Yankee Station, the carrier operating area in the Gulf of Tonkin, became one of the most active patches of ocean in human history. In the Falklands War of 1982, British carriers projected air power 8,000 miles from home, recapturing the islands from Argentina. Without carrier aviation, the operation would have been impossible. In the Gulf War of 1991, 6 American carriers launched over 18,000 combat sorties against Iraqi forces. The opening night of Desert Storm saw carrier aircraft striking Baghdad with precision unimaginable in 1944. And today, in 2026, 11 American supercarriers patrol the world's oceans. Each one displaces over 100,000 tons. Each one carries 75 aircraft. Each one represents the direct technological and doctrinal descendant of the wooden-decked Intrepid that Bill Burton flew from in 1944. The total numbers across 80 years are staggering. Over 5 million carrier sorties flown by American naval aviators since 1945. An estimated 200 million pounds of ordnance delivered. Conflicts shortened. Wars deterred. And somewhere in the calculus of all that history lives, saved that no one will ever count. But the deepest lesson of Musashi's death was not technological. It was human. It was about the courage to challenge an entire institution, to risk being called insane, foolish, or even treasonous, to bet your career, your reputation, sometimes your life on an idea that everyone in authority has already rejected. Billy Mitchell was court-martialed in 1925 for insisting aircraft would sink battleships. He died in 1936, disgraced and broken. He never lived to see his ideas vindicated. But on October 24, 1944, every bomb that hit Musashi was in some sense dropped by Billy Mitchell. The pattern repeats throughout history. The men who said tanks could replace cavalry were ridiculed before 1939. The engineers who insisted submarines would dominate naval warfare were dismissed before 1914. The pilots who argued helicopters would revolutionize warfare were laughed at before Korea. Every revolutionary military idea begins life as insane, and every entrenched military system fights innovation until catastrophe forces change. This is not a problem unique to military institutions. It is the same dynamic that delayed personal computers in the 1970s, smartphones in the 2000s, electric vehicles in the 2010s. Established systems, no matter how powerful, often cannot recognize their own obsolescence until it is sinking before their eyes. What Bill Burton represented, what every American carrier pilot represented in those 6 brutal hours over the Sibuyan Sea, was the proof that institutional momentum can be broken. That ordinary people properly equipped with revolutionary ideas can topple even the most invincible-seeming establishments. And there is one final detail about the sinking of Musashi that almost no one knows. The phone call came on a Tuesday in October 1972. Bill Burton was 52 years old, sitting at his kitchen table in Spencer, Iowa, when his wife, Margaret, handed him the receiver. The voice on the other end spoke in halting English with a heavy Japanese accent. "Mr. Burton, my name is Hiroshi Inoguchi. I am the son of Captain Toshihira Inoguchi. My father was the commander of the battleship Musashi." Burton said nothing for nearly 30 seconds. Hiroshi Inoguchi was now a 38-year-old maritime historian in Tokyo. He had spent years tracking down the American pilots who participated in the October 24, 1944 attack. Through Navy records, declassified after-action reports, and squadron rosters, he had identified Burton as one of the pilots whose torpedo had likely struck Musashi during the second wave. He was not calling to accuse, he was calling to thank. In a long letter that followed the phone call, Hiroshi explained. His father had been a man trapped by an obsolete system. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built a warship designed to fight a war that no longer existed. The men aboard Musashi were sacrificed not by Bill Burton, but by the admirals in Tokyo who refused to accept that the world had changed. My father wrote in his final letter that he hoped his death would teach Japan a lesson. Hiroshi wrote, "That lesson was learned, and it was learned because of men like you who proved what no Japanese admiral would admit. Thank you for ending the war that should never have begun." Burton flew to Tokyo in 1973. He met Hiroshi in person. Together they visited the small memorial in Yokosuka, where the names of Musashi's 1,023 dead are inscribed on a stone wall. Burton stood before that wall for nearly an hour. He removed his Navy Cross from his pocket, the medal he had won for sinking that ship, and placed it at the base of the memorial. "It belongs here more than it belongs in my closet," he reportedly told Hiroshi. He flew home to Iowa the next day. He never spoke of the trip again. But Margaret found after his death in 1989 a photograph of that memorial wall pressed inside his Bible. On the back in his handwriting was a single line: "For the men who deserved better admirals." From a farm boy in Iowa with no view of the ocean to the pilot who helped sink the 2 largest battleships ever built. From an idea called insane in 1925 to a doctrine that has dominated naval warfare for 80 years. Bill Burton and his fellow American naval aviators proved that ordinary people armed with the right idea at the right moment can topple even the most invincible institutions. Over 5,000 American sailors died defeating the Imperial Japanese Navy. Over 4,000 Japanese sailors died defending battleships that could not be defended. And in their combined sacrifice, the world learned a lesson that has saved countless lives in every conflict since. That courage to challenge orthodoxy is sometimes the only thing standing between civilization and catastrophe. If you know another story of military innovation that changed the course of history, share it in the comments below. There are hundreds of these forgotten heroes from World War II, ordinary people who did extraordinary things, and we want to tell their stories next. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into the secret innovations, impossible missions, and unforgettable men and women who shaped the war that shaped our world. Because history is not made by generals and admirals. History is made by the farm boys, the mechanics, the cooks, and the welders, who refuse to accept that the way things are is the way things must remain. The age of the battleship died in the Sibuyan Sea on October 24, 1944. But the age of human courage that killed it lives on in every act of innovation, every challenge to authority, and every brave soul who looks at an impossible problem and whispers the same words Burton whispered to himself in the cockpit of his Avenger. Let's try anyway.